Welcome to Apocalypse. Over the last few weeks, Stephen has been fed stories we've placed on his computer, his phone and television that have led him to believe that the Earth could be hit by a meteor shower. Today is the day the world will end. It's also the day before Stephen's birthday, and I've asked his brother Barry to tell him they've got tickets to see one of his favourite bands, The Killers, perform at a private gig at a secret location miles from anywhere. Stephen doesn't realise they'll never arrive. 6 members of my crew, armed with hidden cameras, are covertly tailing Stephen and Barry, and they take the opportunity to drop in a few final hints about the impending apocalypse. Stephen will be travelling to the concert in a specially chartered coach rigged with hidden cameras. He has no idea I'm on board or that all his fellow passengers are actors.
The key thing about today is I just need you guys to be as natural as possible. He needs to be convinced that you guys are going to a Killers concert with him. I'm going to sit you all down in certain seats and kind of give you your setup. So some of you might be a couple, some of you might just be groups of friends. My role on this is that as soon as that guy arrives, I'm basically the PR person for the concert. So enjoy it and just go with it.
As he steps on the coach and begins his journey, he's unaware that further magnetic disturbances will soon cause it to break down, and his end-of-world adventure will begin. Stephen is on his way to a 1,000-acre former nuclear weapons site that we've rigged with over 60 hidden cameras, 150 microphones and 2,000 meters of cable. A cast and crew of more than 250 people have devoted thousands of hours in the preparation and execution of this project. It is vital that Stephen has no idea he's being filmed.
Sorry guys, I don't know what's going on here, something's wrong with the engine.
Maybe we should get comfy.
We're interrupting this programme to bring you a special news announcement. Here's Matt Dyson.
A statement from the government has been released saying that a meteorite collision with Earth is imminent.
This is a statement from Cabinet Office Briefing Room A for the attention of all citizens of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. The meteor, Swift A, is predicted to collide with the British Isles imminently. A short while ago, Parliament declared an official state of level 3 emergency. The overwhelming likelihood is that communications networks will be severely disrupted, if not destroyed. In this event, police services will be supported by the armed forces to ensure civil order is maintained in major cities and areas of dense population. Government registration bureaus will open up proportional resource centres. You are urged to do this immediately.
That man's trying to read.
Unknown to him.